RTV Virgilio. Adesso su canale 819 Sky.
Vuoi risparmiare energia e ridurre i costi della bolletta? Con 100 raggi si può. Fai una scelta facile e vantaggiosa. Metti l'energia pura del sole sul tetto di casa tua. Con centinaia di impianti fotovoltaici realizzati, la società cooperativa 100 Raggi è garanzia di qualità e professionalità per abitazioni, industrie, alberghi e pubbliche amministrazioni. Col supporto di 100 Raggi e con i contributi statali, i costi dell'impianto sono minimi e la tua bolletta diventa subito piccola piccola. Scegli il fotovoltaico, scegli 100 Raggi, la cooperativa dove ecologia fa rima con economia. 100 Raggi, a Brescia, in via Diaz 18A.
The global population has hit a staggering 7 billion, and in many of the world's largest cities, overcrowding is forcing some, especially the young, to live life on the streets. We travel to Mexico City to go deep inside their perilous world. One of the most famous landmarks of Mexico City is the Golden Angel, who watches over the more than 20 million inhabitants of this vast urban sprawl. But the angel looks down on some more kindly than others.
I've been living on the streets for around 13 or 14 years. My name is Marisol. I'm 24 years old. My son's called Diego, and he's nearly 1.
Marisol is one of the many young people, mostly in their teens and 20s, who carve a life for themselves in the squalid and often dangerous conditions of the Mexico City streets. Official figures cite some 3,000 people living on the streets. Many argue the figure is 10 times higher. A large number of them have come to the capital city from rural areas, driven by a lack of jobs or, like Marisol, to escape family violence.
I decided to live on my own on the streets when I'd had enough of living with my father. I couldn't stand that he was abusing me. He wanted to continue doing this to me. So I left.
Marisol was only 11 years old, and it wasn't just her father who was abusing her.
Not only was I abused by my own father, but also by my uncle, by another uncle, and another uncle. All this is really hard for me.
Today, Marisol lives in a flimsy shack amidst piles of rubbish with a gang of other kids she calls her family. This family is one of many such groups of kids who are drawn together by their struggle for survival. Some live in makeshift shelters on traffic islands, and others even live in dark holes underground. They survive how they can. Some beg, some clean car windows from early morning to late at night. Life expectancy for these kids is just 30 years old.
Firstly, you can die from drugs.
The drug is an industrial solvent which eventually rots the body and the brain. It's called Mona, and it kills hunger and temporarily lifts the kids out of the horror of their daily lives. Another constant threat is gang violence.
Sometimes there are fights between us, even in our own gang.
But even greater dangers await the girls.
For women, the biggest problem they face is exploitation. Sexual exploitation, exploitation at work, and emotional exploitation.
Edna Madai works for an organization called Fundación Renacimiento, which helps street kids. Girls are particularly vulnerable. Prostitution to earn money for food, she says, is common, and so is having to earn a place in a gang.
If a girl wants to be able to join and become a part of a group, she has to let some of the boys have sex with her.
And with that comes the very real risk of contracting HIV and sexual diseases. And unplanned pregnancies are another danger, something this girl knows all too well.
My name is Guadalupe Medrano Marcas, and I'm 6 months pregnant. I'm 15 years old, but I'll be 16 soon.
Lupita, as she's known, and her 14-year-old boyfriend Adrian are expecting their first child.
It's not moving now because it might be asleep, but suddenly it will move.
Lupita has been living on the streets since she was 9 years old. Like Marisol, she was abused by her father.
He beat me and made me do all the housework.
Even her stepmother could not protect her.
She couldn't stop him because she wasn't my own family, so she let him beat me.
And so Lupita fled, planning to live on the streets on her own. But she was soon taken by the police to a shelter, one of several in Mexico City, offering street kids a safe haven.
I escaped. It wasn't that I didn't like it. I felt more restricted in the shelter than in the street.
Like many kids, she has spent the last years in and out of shelters. And in the summer of 2010, Lupita and Adrian met at one of them. But just a few months later, they, like so many other kids, returned to the streets. Now they struggle to make ends meet. At the moment, they are living in a room in an abandoned house shared with drug dealers. There are dangers everywhere, but Lupita believes that alongside Adrian, she's safe.
I'm not scared because I know I'm fine with my partner, and he's going to support me and to protect both me and the baby. He's always looked out for me.
But they have no running water, no electricity, and no sanitation. They sleep on the hard floor, and both dream of a different life.
I want my house to have furniture, a heater, a sink to wash properly, water, a bed so we're not on the floor, and, more importantly, so that the baby is not on the floor.
But for now, their reality is this room. And while the back streets are emptying, for the young couple, their daily work of earning a living begins.
We're looking for bottles.
Plastic bottles to sell them.
They search for hours. Tonight, they had an average haul. They made just 25 cents.
Gracias.
Lupita! Adrian!
The next day, they receive a visit from Edna, the outreach worker. For 12 years, she has been working with street kids, winning their trust and ultimately trying to get them to move into a shelter permanently. Today, she and her colleague David accompany the couple to a clinic for their first prenatal check.
Medrano Márquez Guadalupe. Buenas tardes, pasaría.
Do you know your blood group? No? Do you know what inoculations you've had?
No.
It turns out Lupita is a month farther along in her pregnancy than she thought. She's around 7 months pregnant. Edna knows it's urgent to get them into the safe environment of a shelter before the birth.
Because we are speaking about 2 children who are expecting another child. If they can get themselves to a place where they can be looked after, I think they will have a chance.
Their future, Edna believes, rides on them turning their backs on street life. And so does Marisol's and her baby Diego. If she can be persuaded to leave the dangerous life of violence and drugs, there's a chance that Diego won't be taken away from her, as happened to all 3 of her other children.
They took them away from me because I was on the streets, taking drugs and stuff.
Although still living in the shack with her boyfriend, it seems Marisol is determined to make some changes in her life and not lose Diego too. Now she visits daily the shelter Edna works for. They receive medical care. Diego's checkup shows him to be alarmingly underweight and underdeveloped. A result, the doctor believes, of him breathing in the solvent drugs sniffed by his parents.
Has he been sick?
No, but he's starting to cough.
Marisol also receives contraceptives and treatment for her drug addiction.
Marisol needs lots of support. She needs to feel a bond with something, and above all, she needs to feel loved and respected.
So that the kids on the street don't feel abandoned, we have to bring their situation to public attention.
Diego Palacios is representative of the United Nations Population Fund in Mexico, which is working with the Mexican government to help these kids at risk.
México tiene un gran reto hacia el futuro.
Mexico is facing great challenges for the future. So it's fundamental that public policies are adopted which fully recognize the need of young people and guarantee them a future filled with promise and opportunities.
Opportunities which both Lupita and Marisol would welcome.
I don't know what the future holds for my kids. If they're going to be the same as me or worse than me. I don't know, but I've got to get out of all of this, both for my kids and for me. I'm going to do it. I'm going to come through this.
A conviction echoed by Lupita and Adrián. They too have made a decision about their future.
We're looking for a place to have the baby.
And that place is a shelter.
Buenos días. Buenos días.
When they arrive, they are given something to eat.
¿Se les puede dar desayunar, por favor?
Sí, con mucho gusto.
Gracias, señora.
And Lupita organizes her few possessions and breathes a sigh of relief to be somewhere safe.
Now I have a bed and somewhere I can live well, where my baby will be fine, and where they are going to support us. Underneath a real roof, and not where everyone's taking drugs. That's why I decided to come here.
This time, it's hoped that she will make a home in the shelter, rather than return, once again, to the streets. boomtown. This is Baku, Azerbaijan's capital on the Caspian Sea. Vast oil reserves are fueling massive construction and a drastic reduction in poverty. Good news for some, but for others it's brought terror right into the home.
Don't do it! I'm standing here! Scum! Don't do this! Stop!
This is eviction Baku style. Police officers and city workers surround a building and smash their way into an apartment owned by Nuria Khalikova. She captures what happens on her small camera.
I will put you in prison, or I will throw myself out of the window. Stop!
But it's no use. Within minutes, the men have forced their way in. Feeling ill, Nuria lies on a couch but continues to film.
Who are you, and why are you here, wandering in my apartment?
No one answers Nuria's questions. This is a scene that is being repeated right across Azerbaijan. On one side, developers with the power of new money, and in many cases the authorities behind them, are sweeping away old and often unsanitary housing. On the other, many communities argue that they're being forced out of their homes without regard to the law. On the day of her eviction, Nuria, a librarian who lives on her own, is removed and held at a police station for 9 hours before being allowed to return to her building. She starts filming again as her neighbor discovers the stairs to her apartment have been destroyed.
We have a huge problem in Azerbaijan related to the property rights.
Rena Safalieva works for Transparency International, a group that promotes the rule of law and monitors corruption worldwide.
It suffices just to look out of the window and to see how Baku is booming. We have a construction boom, and we had and still have lots of old houses without proper sanitation, which have to be demolished. So I am not against this tendency as such, but the way the issue is handled leaves much more to be desired.
For Nuria, the issue came to a head when the city authorities decided to create a new park in the center of Baku, and her former home lay right in its path. The authorities say they offered residents generous financial compensation and spacious apartments to move into. But Nuria and several hundred residents refused the offer, complaining compensation was way below market rates and that alternative apartments were in terrible condition or too far away.
In Nuria's case, for about a year, she lived in a state of suspense and fear. This is not a good way to proceed.
We made repeated requests to city officials to comment on Nuria's situation without success. In the meantime, her film drew the attention of activists who quickly picked up on her case. They argue that women like her need greater power to defend their rights and increased representation in government. Currently, only 11% of members of parliament are women. Nuria herself had challenged her impending eviction in court, but to no avail, as she explains to Rena Safrileva. The authorities, she says, didn't wait for a legal decision. They simply began tearing her building down, starting with the roof.
They evicted you without a court ruling?
Yes, without a court decision, just by breaking in.
Today, Nuria returns to the site of her former home. This is all that remains.
I feel bitterness. I want to cry. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I always loved my country, and I love it now. But you can't treat people like this.
Nuria spots an ex-neighbor.
For a long time, we were afraid of everything. We were scared and we were crying. We are still trembling.
These residents' homes are next in line for demolition. Some residents are planning to respond to their eviction by taking the case to the European Court of Human Rights, which has been available to Azeri citizens since 2002. And in the longer term, Transparency International's Rena Safraleva and a group of female activists led by this campaigner are pushing for further human rights reforms to protect people like Nuria. Together, they have created a women's parliament.
No matter how many difficulties and problems we might have at the moment, I believe in the future of Azerbaijan because I believe in the people of Azerbaijan.
Shokla Ismail is the founder of Azerbaijan's Women's Parliament. It's an initiative which is being nurtured and monitored by the United Nations Democracy Fund. The goal is to empower women by giving them a greater say over their own lives. To achieve this, they are aiming to increase women's meager representation in government.
A lot of people believe that this sort of democracy and, development will come from abroad, especially from the West. And this is not the feeling which I share. Support should be there. Without support, we will not manage. But after all, this is a people of any country which should make difference.
In addition to taking on cases like the evictions in Baku, the activists plan to ensure that better health services are provided for women, like this maternity school that Shokla has set up.
Nobody is going to make the revolution for us. It might take a year, it might take 10 years, but anyway, this is something which should come from us, and this is in our hands.
But in the immediate future, Nuria discovers that for some women, things seem to be going from bad to worse. As we continue walking with her through her old district, we come across workmen demolishing yet another house.
Look, they recognize me. They say hello to me. These are the marauders that were at work in my neighborhood. They are now asking how I'm getting on. How would you think I'm getting on?
Then a woman in the next entrance beckons us to come inside. She leads us to a doorway on the landing. This room right next to her own apartment was occupied by a neighbor who moved out. The building is literally being torn down around her. The woman and 35 families have lodged an appeal against the demolitions, and she says she's determined to stay put until the court decision. This despite the fact that the workmen, she says, have threatened her.
They said we would be buried under the bulldozers. That's when they started to bulldoze us. We should be quick to get out of here, one by one.
In the same block, even as these demolitions go ahead, a women's crisis centre is still operating to provide counselling for the local residents. A year living in fear has left its mark on Nuria.
You can't imagine what kind of psychological trauma this is. I can't even explain how I survived it. If only it was possible to remove that part of my brain.
A few weeks after we filmed this, in another blow to Nuria, the Women's Crisis Centre was itself demolished, seemingly leaving her with little help and no hope. But not everyone thinks her efforts have been in vain.
Her courage will help other people. With the help of civil society, we should raise awareness of the government that these things are not to be tolerated, and the government should design clear procedures to handle situations like that.
And she sees encouraging signs that the government is responding. Earlier this year, Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev announced reforms and pledged a new drive against injustice and corruption. What's more, Nuria's film, with the support from activists, has helped draw international attention to the situation in Baku. After the destruction of the Women's Crisis Centre, the spokesperson for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights called on the Azerbaijani authorities to investigate the forced evictions and, if necessary, to provide adequate compensation and restitution. Nuria herself has now found an apartment to live in. After borrowing heavily, she was able to buy one in the city. A survivor, she is now intent on moving on with her life.
I want to live in peace, to have a normal life. I don't want to worry about the roof being demolished over my head. I just want to live in peace.
RTV Virgilio. Adesso su canale 819 Sky.